There is a story on the back of one of Bob Dylan's albums that talks about three wise men who are going around the world looking for the truth of the latest Dylan album. And they go from hither to yon and so forth and can't find it. Finally, they find a man by the name of Frank. And they ask Frank, do you have the truth of the latest Dylan album? And he says, I have it. And they said, we've been searching for it. Where is it? So Frank goes over to his closet, and he opens up his closet door, and there is just an abyss, infinite abyss, going back into the closet. And Frank says to the three wise men, as they look into the closet, he says, the truth is in there. How far do you want to go in? And the three wise men look at each other and they say, oh, not too far, just far enough to say we've been there. How much of what life is all about is that indeed we have a project, we are about a project in terms of examining the truth of human existence up to the point where too much discomfort does not follow. Nietzsche talks about all truth being bloody truth. All truth being bloody truth. And of course, if we look at Christianity, both in the form of Christ and in the first 300 years, indeed, this is bloody truth. I mean, I think it is really important to understand that in the first 300 years of Christianity, when the church was totally pacific, that this teaching was not a teaching from ivory tower scholars to the unwashed masses. In the first 300 years of Christianity, most Christians lived in a colonized world on the margins of destitution. They lived from hand to mouth. If you look in the Jewish graveyard, Jews had graveyards at that time, and you look at the average age that people died at, and I use Jewish only because the Jews were a community, so there was some community support, and a secular community in the sense of being concerned about secular issues internally with the community. The average age at the time of Jesus at which people died was 35 years old. 35. And so when we have the church proclaiming a gospel of nonviolent love, we have that proclamation in the context of a world in which the world empire, the Roman government, on 3 separate occasions conducted extensive efforts at extermination of the Christian community. This is not an ivory tower teaching. From the year 65 AD, the Emperor Nero, to the year 260 AD, the Emperor Valerian, it was a capital offense in the Roman Empire to be a Christian. That is, death. Prosecuted with more or less vigor, depending upon the particular emperor. Then there is a short break, and then it starts all over again until about 313. 3 separate occasions, the emperor explicitly declared that what the empire must be about is the liquidation of the Christian community. It is in that context that the church proclaims unequivocally that Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolence. Needless to say, the church survives. Not only does the church survive, the church moves from a handful of inauspicious people in Jerusalem to, by the time of Constantine, becoming the major religion in the empire. That's why Constantine tolerated Christianity and issued the Edict of Milan. Tertullian sums it up by saying, the blood of martyrs is the seed of Christianity. And what he means is, the witness unto death is impressive. For the Greek word for martyr and the Greek word for witness are exactly the same word. It is impressive to choose a course of life where one would rather die with one's truth than live without it. That's quite a serious statement about what you believe. You know, you go over and you sit down at the faculty club at Harvard or the University of Minnesota, you know, and down there for lunch or dinner or whatever the case may be, and all kinds of people talking about truth. You know, geez, they're pounding their fist on the bar or on the table talking about truth, you know. And they are certain and this and that and the other thing. This is the truth on all kinds of issues. Mathematics, political science, law. Now, how many of those people that are so vigorously proclaiming truth, if someone walked in a machine gun and said, if you keep that truth, you're going to die, how many of them would say, well, we don't have to be radical, you know. But that's the difference. Huh? In the early Christian community, when the Roman Empire said, adore Caesar as God, or die, there was no question. When the Roman Empire said, join the army or die, there was no question. You want to know how serious it was? How serious, how sure that the Christian church was that you could not be in the military and be a Christian. One of the oldest liturgical documents that we have, the Canon of Hippolytus, dating from 215 AD, lists the requirements to become a catechumen. A catechumen, not even to be baptized, just to enter into the process to become a Christian. One of the requirements is you cannot be a pimp. If you're a pimp, you have to give up being a pimp. Because to be a pimp is so far beyond the mind of Christ, so far outside the mind of Christ, that you could not possibly be seriously considering entering into Christianity and want to remain in the occupation of pimp. The very next line after pimp is, if you are in the military, you must resign. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's just a given. How serious was the early church about the use of violence being inconsistent with the mind of Christ, with carrying out the message of Christ, with being in conformity of the will of God as revealed by Christ? To kill for any reason, in the pursuit of self-interest, in the pursuit of self-defense, or for social responsibility, to kill for any reason was not just a sin. It was one of the 3 excommunicable offenses in the early church. You were excommunicated. Serious. Remember the context in which this is taking place. It is taking place in the context of people, most of whom live in dire poverty, and all of whom are living under the threat of execution from the Roman Empire. And the teaching is unequivocal. And the church survives, and the church grows with no clever administration, no wealth, no temples, and becomes the major religion in the empire. So, when we reflect on the Christian experience and how we must participate in terms of our existence in this time and place in terms of it, it may be helpful to consider this. Since Christ stood before Pilate, there has been what is commonly called in history a church-state problem, or a Caesar-Christ problem. Why? In the history of religion, we can pretty much break up religions into three distinct categories. Remember what religion is. Religion basically comes out of a question. The religious consciousness is founded in a question. What kind of God is God if God exists? And what does God expect of me, if anything? There's three general ways that people throughout history have gone about answering that question. The first kind of way, the first kind of religion that people have worked out is what might be called, is called liturgical religion. Liturgical religion, in answer to the question, what kind of God is God if God exists and what does God expect? Liturgical religion simply says what God expects is cult. And as long as the cult is performed correctly, then God looks favorably upon the people and nothing more is desired or needed. And therefore, when you see a religion that has become simply involved with a kind of mentality where literally people go crazy if the cult isn't performed in detail, in minutiae, you can pretty much assume that what we're talking about in that situation is people who in their hearts really do think that this is the primary place, the central place where God meets the human being in the cult. That what is expected primarily of the human being is proper participation in the cult, in the liturgy. The next kind of religion in world religions that we can talk about is conceptual religion. And by conceptual religion, what we mean is that what the religion expects is affirmation of cognitive propositions, saying yes to particular ways of understanding God and human reality in nature. For example, it is satisfactory to be a member of the religion simply to say there are three persons in one God. Cognitive affirmation. No more is expected than that, than a yes to a proposition. The third kind of religion is what is called incarnational. The spiritual presupposition of incarnational religion is that truth is meant primarily to be lived. That the purpose of truth is to live it, not simply to celebrate it, not simply to know it. The purpose of truth is to, inflesh it, incarnate it, to conform one's life to it. Christianity is primarily, and in the first instance, an incarnational religion, by the words of the founder himself. It is not those who say, Lord, Lord, the liturgical, but those who do the will. If you have something against your brother and sister, leave your gifts at the altar and straighten it out incarnationally. Then come back and we'll get back to this. That's fine. Conceptual, liturgical religion is low-risk religion. Liturgical religion makes almost no demands on people. As a matter of fact, cult tends to be just a way of religiously legitimatizing whatever people are doing, saying it's in conformity with God's will. Low-risk religion. Conceptual religion, well, the risk is a little higher, huh? Ideas have legs, and people can think on ideas, and they can cause trouble. Societies burn books and so forth. There's a certain power to ideas, indeed. But it more or less can be carried out in secret. You can think in secret, read in secret. Christianity, from the time of its foundation to this very moment in time, has had a church-state problem because Christianity is primarily an incarnational religion. That is, because it makes demands on how time is used moment in and moment out. Incarnational religion is high-risk religion. Because one of the fundamental questions of life is what to do with time, how to use time. One of the fundamental theological questions is how to use time. Christianity is a religion, is a way of approaching existence that point-blankly says how to use time, that tells you what to do with time, that tells you what to do with life's time. That is, in thought, word, and deed. It is a religion that indeed has behavioral consequences, expects behavioral differences. The state is an institution that also expects behavioral conformity. And as we'll see in a little while, the values of the state are not the values of the church. And the state and the church can very easily make contradictory demands on the person at the same time. Contradictory calls for allegiance. And then the problem arises. Because the person can only act one way at one time. If the state demands that the person pick up the gun, and the religion demands the person not pick up the gun, then the crisis moment comes at some point. And the Christian must choose. Incarnational religion, which is what Christianity is. Not that the incarnational religion doesn't have its conceptual elements, certainly that it doesn't have its liturgical elements. But the name of the game in Christianity is that the Word is to be made flesh. Christ is to be incarnated. The truth is to be lived. Let me say it theologically in a sentence with an imprimatur on it. The peak experience of the Christian life is the deed of love. And we must never forget that. The peak experience of the Christian life is the deed of love. That is, love as Christ would love. The state, to a large extent, is not particularly interested in deeds of love. And so, we have contradictory demands being made on the person at the same time, different calls to loyalty. In order to examine how this works out and what precisely we're talking about, in this whole church-state conflict, it is serious. So serious that it's almost something that the Christian church can't talk about. the capitulation to the state universally by the church since the time of Constantine has been substantial. What I like to do is I like to see if, in terms of Christ's teachings of nonviolent love, if I can elucidate precisely what the problem is between the church and the state. Wherein lies the problem? I will say this to begin with. If one does not believe in Christ, then there's no problem. Or, if one believes Christ justifies violence, there is no problem. The problem enters in, but enters in like a cataclysm if Christ's teachings are teachings of nonviolent love. Then there is an enormous problem, and the question is, how far back into the truth do we want to go? But let's remember before we start that the church we live in is embryonic. At best, it's just born. 2,000 years is nothing in the history of time and space. We talk about a 2,000-year-old tradition or something like that as if it were ancient. It's nothing in terms of millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of years of time and space in the past, and indefinite amount of time and space into the future. If the church is true, if it is what it says it is, then it is open to an indefinite expansion in time and space. And therefore, because the church has followed a particular policy up to a particular moment in time, or made particular compromises, it can be clearly seen as understandable as the church works itself out. But the fundamental question remains always, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, what does maximal, not minimal, what does maximal fidelity to Christ and his teachings entail in this moment in time? For it is only through fidelity to the means of Christ that there is any hope of overcoming evil and death. So let us begin and reflect on this a little bit. I'd like to use a little analogy in terms of the government that we work with, but it pertains to all governments at all places at all times. I know a man back in Boston who's an accountant, was an accountant, alcoholic now, he's in his 50s, his life is destroyed through booze, and his family's destroyed and so forth. And I don't know, from some people, a guy on the Celtics gives him some tickets to scalp every once in a while, and some other people give him a few other things. And he lives in the Pine Street Inn, which is a home for folks that are having trouble, derelicts, move in and out, and just get a meal and have a place to sleep in the winter, and this sort of very, very, very bad shape, you know. So his total income on any given year might be something like $2,500. Someone in our society who's making an average living, let's say, is making $14,000. Someone who's really doing pretty well is, let's say, making $50,000. But at some place, and it makes no difference whether it's 50 or 70 or 100, at some place a break occurs, and we begin to get people who no longer make a living with 8 hours or 9 hours or 5 hours or 10 hours a day work. We begin to get people who make most of their living off of the labor of others. In this society, that kind of thing is called living off interest. That is, for example, the fellow who was going to buy North Vietnam. Remember the one when he, in order to get the prisoners out, he was just going to buy the whole country. H. Ross Perot. Huh? Seems to be worth about $400 million. Kennedy family seems to be worth the same amount, $400 million. Last year in the presidential elections, Ted Kennedy, had to list his income. And his income, I believe, was $469,000 for that year, taxable income. That doesn't count the municipal bonds and so forth, which are tax-free. $469,000 in taxable income, of which 63 was earned, and 400 and something was simply interest. At any rate, all I'm saying is, at some point, soon after $50,000, in around there, 100 doesn't make much difference, people begin to live off other people's labor primarily, and they're not welfare people. And even in our society, this is not the highest level of things. It's hard to get a handle on these sorts of things, but apparently, if we include the foundation, which we must, because the foundation is only a tax gimmick in which to use money in a tax-free manner. If we include the Rockefeller Foundation, each brother in the line of Winthrop, Nelson, and so forth apparently is worth about $500 million. Now, $500 million goes a long way, especially in a corporate capitalistic society where if you own 2% of the Chase Manhattan Bank, you've got it. You own the whole thing. All I'm communicating here is nothing that hasn't been known. That is, that within the society there are economic classes. And that's so in every society. Let us not kid ourselves that Brezhnev walks around like the peasant in the street. He does not. It never has, it does not exist, or that Mao did or anyone else does. There are economic classes. On the political side, in our system, we have the executive branch, we have the judicial branch, and we have the legislative branch. Now, I haven't seen the figures for the 1980 election. I don't suppose they're any less. But in the 1976 election, to get this office here, cost $100 million. $100 million is what was spent to procure the presidency of the United States. Now, where does that money come from? From this group of people? From this group? No. It comes from over here. It comes from over here. And that's just a fact. Here's a little article. I'll just read you a paragraph from it, from the Boston Globe regarding campaign spending. It says, if money is not the root of all evil, there are times when it comes perilously close. This is especially true in politics, where large campaign contributions are often synonymous with the purchase of influence. Senator Russell Long said, when you are talking in terms of a large campaign contribution, the distinction between a campaign contribution and a bribe is almost a hairline's worth of difference. You can hardly tell one from the other. In the 1970 campaign, 90% of all recorded campaign contributions came from the wealthiest 1% of the society. 90% from the wealthiest 1%. Let me give you another fact. In presidential, senatorial, congressional, gubernatorial elections in the United States since 1900, the candidate that has spent the most money has won the election 85% of the time. 14% of the time, it's been the candidate that's spent the second amount of money, and there's about 1% all other candidates. It's a fact, huh? It's just a fact. The money comes from here. The money comes from here. Did you ever try to raise $2,000 for a worthy cause, to feed starving children? It's tough. And we're talking about $100 million. In Massachusetts, which is a small state geographically, a senatorial campaign, a man just announced to run for the Senate against Ted Kennedy, and he says he's collected $4 million so far. This man's almost a sure loser, and he's collected $4 million. In places like California, we're talking $15, $20, $25 million for a senatorial campaign. Where does that money come from? These people? Impossible. Or what about, we always say, well, you know, if these people blow it too much, the judicial always keeps them in their place. You know, the Constitution is a document open to indefinite interpretation. How does the federal judiciary come into existence? By the appointment of the executive with the advice and consent of the Senate. Are these people about to appoint someone here that is going to interpret against the interest to keep them in office? Of course not. It's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. Are these people about to appoint someone here, people here who are going to rule that every person charged with a criminal offense has to have the level of legal competence that Haldeman and Ehrlichman had? Of course not. It's never going to happen. A criminal lawyer is supposed to have no more than 125 cases a year. Not ethically, but in terms of the ability simply to handle and research the cases. The average public defender has over 400 cases a year. No, it's not about to interpret the Constitution inconsistent with these interests. All right, so the question becomes that all we're saying is, in the United States, in every country on the face of the earth, there is an intimate, irrevocable connection between wealth and political power. Between wealth and political power. These people give the money to put these people in office because why? Because these people want these people, who are the lawmakers, to make the laws consistent with their interest. That's all. They want laws that are consistent with their interest. Simple as that. Nothing tricky, just pretty straightforward. And what would you do? Suppose, this is from the American Catholic Bishops, it's a book called Poverty in American Democracy. What would you do if you were over here? Do you know the kind of wealth that we're talking about? I don't think we really have a sense. This is from the American Catholic Bishops, and I'll just read you the figures here, but the state of New Jersey, or better yet, the state of Rhode Island. The state of Rhode Island is, space-wise, the state of Rhode Island is 3/4 of a million acres, okay? That's the size of the state of Rhode Island. 3/4 of a million acres. It's a whole state, 3/4 of a million acres. Listen to these figures. This is the land owned by these companies in the United States, not worldwide, in the United States. This is the U.S. acreage. Texaco, remember, Rhode Island, 3/4 of a million acres. Texaco, 9.9 million acres of land in the United States. Gulf, 7.5 million acres. Union Oil, 4.1 million acres. Burlington Northern, 8.4 million acres. Union Pacific, 7.9 million acres. International Paper, 7.0 million acres. Weyerhaeuser, 5.6 million acres. Georgia Pacific, 4.5 million acres. ITT, 2.1 million acres. Southern Pacific, 5.1 million acres. Continental Oil, 4.5 million acres. Standard Oil of California, 5.2 million acres. Standard Oil of Indiana, 20.3 million acres. It's incredible. State of Rhode Island, 750,000 acres. Look at this. And what would you do if you were in that position? Or consider these figures. You know, this is the American Catholic Bishops. It's not Mother Jones magazine or something, you know. The first figure I read you is the net profit, not the income, the net profit of the company in 1971. The second figure is the federal income tax paid. Alcoa Aluminum, net profit, $50,199,000. Federal income tax, 0. Continental Oil, double that. Net profit, $109,030,000. Federal income tax, 0. Gulf and Western, $51,381,000 net profit. Federal income tax, 0. McDonnell Douglas, $144,613,000 net profit. Federal income tax, 0. Bethlehem Steel, $122,071,000. Income tax, 0. Consolidated Edison, $110,027,000. Federal income tax paid, 0, and so forth and so on. Now look, some guy making $14,000 a year, goes to work 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year, 250 days a year, right? Works a construction job or something. Takes his lunch with him, you know, bologna sandwich, carton of milk and an apple, say it's $1. He deducts $1 a day for lunch. It's a business expense. If he doesn't eat, he doesn't work. Construction work is hard work. You've got to physically have the food to eat. If he doesn't bring it with him, he has to buy it, one or the other. So he deducts $250 from his income tax. In about 4 months, the IRS is on top of him because he didn't pay his fair share of taxes. He owes $250 more. And here's companies making $50 and $100 million. I don't know, this guy making $14,000. Think about it a little bit. Suppose that the president of Consolidated Edison goes out and has lunch. You know, goes to the Ritz-Carlton in Boston and has a $115 lunch. Lunches are $115 at the Ritz-Carlton. You know, 3 drinks, that sort of business. Huh? Brings a few of his friends with him. The whole thing's deductible. Whole thing's deductible. But the guy that brings a brown bag lunch for $1, apple, a couple sandwiches, milk, can't deduct it. Why? Well, you know the reason why. That's the law. That's all. Simple as that. That's the law. Brown bag lunches aren't deductible. 3 martini lunches at the Ritz-Carlton are deductible. Simple as that. Now, of course, these people make the laws consistent with their interest. But here's the point. It's not really law that they want, is it? That's not what they want. When this money is given to make sure these people are put in office, indeed, they want the laws, they want the people, the lawmakers, to make laws consistent with protecting, sustaining, and enhancing their interest. But they want more than the law, don't they? What they want is, they want the organized violence of the state in back of their interest. For all law is grounded in violence. No violence, no law. There is no such thing as a nonviolent law. There is a common law saying that's used in court all the time that an unenforceable law is no law, which simply means if you make a rule and you can't back it up if people don't obey it with threatening people that they're going to be hurt, you don't have a law. What you have is a platitude. The draft, the draft registration, it's a law. It says people are to go down and pull their register and so forth. And what is, all law has an enforcing clause. What's the enforcing clause in the draft? I think it's $5,000 and 5 years in prison or something like that. Of course. And every law has that. If you do not obey, the organized violence of the state will be employed against you if we catch you. We will hurt you. All law is backed up by the willingness to hurt people, to do violence to people. And that violence can be anything from taking their money to capital, killing them. And that is the reality of law in this world. There is no nonviolent law in this world. St. Paul says it another way. St. Paul says all law is rooted in fear. Fear. Fear that if I do not obey, I will be hurt. Dan Berrigan. I remember one time we were at a thing and someone asked him about civil disobedience and so forth, and he said the normal place of the Christian is to be an outlaw. And everyone started moaning and saying, oh God, there he goes again into civil disobedience and so forth. No. What he was talking about is the normal place of the Christian is to be outside the law in terms of personal motivation. That is, to be outside the fear mechanisms of the law. The Christian is to be motivated by Christ and his gospel. If the law conforms to that, fine, the law can be obeyed. If the law does not conform to that, then the answer is no. The law is not to be obeyed because it is inconsistent with God's will. But it is not the law that should be motivating. It should be the gospel. One should be outside of fear, outside of the law, as far as a motivating technique for personal activity. The way this is structured, in terms of philosophically is this: power. Power. Power, Bertrand Russell defines power as the capacity to make things happen, the ability to produce change. That's all. Capacity to make things happen, the ability to produce change. There are many forms of power in the world. Love or care. These are all forms of power. If I care for you when you're hurt, that produces a change that would otherwise not be there if I didn't care for you. One form of power is what's called dominative power. Dominative power is defined as the capacity to produce change through the threat of suffering or death. The capacity to produce change through the threat of suffering and death. In terms of jurisprudence, the philosophy of law, all law is grounded in dominative power. Which effectively means what? Since states are ways of organizing people around law, all states are grounded in violence. No violence, no possibility of a state existing. Serious problem. And so, think about it a little bit. Suppose, here we have Standard Oil of Indiana, or I guess that one, 20 million acres 20 times, more than 20 times larger than the state of Rhode Island in the United States. Now suppose we have a family living in the ghetto section of Boston. I mean, really crowded in, white or black. They're both white and black ghettos in Boston where things are bad, really bad. People just crowd in on top of one another, and we know what happens even to animals when that kind of crowding goes on. High crime, drugs, alcohol, people just not having any room to move, and to try to bring children up in that kind of world is just disastrous, just disastrous. There's just no space to function as a human being. Now suppose a father and a mother who are just up to here with that, see their children being destroyed. Suppose they were to go out and just, you know, just take a couple of 100 feet of the 20 million acres of Standard Oil of Indiana's land. Not that's being used or anything. I mean, just go and begin to build a house on it. What would happen? Well, you know what would happen. The local manager of Standard Oil would come and say, you've got to move from there, that's not your land. And they would say what? They'd say, but, you know, you've got 20 million acres, 20 times the size of the state of Rhode Island. No, we want a couple 100 feet so we can have a little space to raise a few children. Look where we're living. He says, you got to go. He said, well, we're not going. Then what would happen? Call the sheriff, right? Sheriff would come and say you have to leave. If they didn't leave, what would he do? Right? Pull the gun. What police carry on their side, not lollipops. They're instruments of human destruction. That's one of their purposes. And when they raise them, they're telling you, you're about to be maimed or destroyed unless you obey. Very clearly. And so the guy leaves with his family. Huh? And maybe he's thrown in jail for a couple of days. And in jail, he has time to think about it. He says, 20 million acres, and I'm asking, it's a couple 100 feet, it's not being used. So he decides to go back. And he goes back with his family. And this time the sheriff comes, and as the sheriff walks up, the guy pulls a gun. And then what happens? The sheriff leaves, huh? And he comes back with what? State police, National Guard, or whatever else it is, huh? The organized violence of the state. Or consider. I don't know if you've had a busing problem here, but back in, stay away from the content of the issue, whether busing is a good idea or not. But in Boston, when the schools were integrated, and to this day, what is required? Hundreds upon hundreds of off-duty police, state police, local police, metropolitan police, special security guards, walking around the schools, walking around the area, all saying the same thing. Judge-made law is going to be backed up, or else you're going to be hurt if you don't follow. And the judge said what? The judge said to the parents who refused to send their children to school, if you do not send your children to school, we will take them away from you, because you are not good parents according to the law. Which is what? How can you take children away? By violence. All law is backed up by violence. Two people come in. Mary and Jane come into court. And Mary says Jane owes her $5,000, and Jane says Mary owes her $5,000. They get all their legal rights to explain their case. They take it all the way to the Supreme Court, every ounce of due process they can possibly get. And finally the judge says, Mary, you pay Jane $5,000. And Mary pays Jane $5,000. Why? Because she thinks the judge is omniscient? That has some special wisdom? Well, of course not. You know. Judge is a lawyer that knows a governor. We've got a judge in Boston. We've got a judge in Boston whose sole credential seems to be, when he was made judge, that he carried donuts out to the governor's house on Sunday. Why? Why does Mary pay Jane the $5,000? Because the judge has the entire organized violence of the state, the police power of the state it's called, which includes the police and the military, to back up his demand in this particular case that Mary can leave there hating Jane worse than when she walked in. That's irrelevant. But she must pay. The judge can put her in jail, he can attach a salary, he can take her car, sell her home. How is that all done? That's all done with violence. All law is backed up by violence. All human law is backed up by violence. And so, I think it's very, very important to realize that that is so of the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law is backed up by violence. If a man and woman are caught committing adultery, then the woman is stoned to death. The man, he lives for another day. Other things are done, but he's not capital punishment. And so, this is where the essence of the problem between the church and state focuses. Given the opportunity, would Jesus have been Prime Minister of Israel? And if not, how can his followers be President of the United States or any subdivision thereof? Why wouldn't he have been President or Prime Minister of Israel? Because the means that are required to keep the human arrangement that we call a state in existence are contradictory to the means that he was proclaiming as the will of God. Back in Boston, when John Kennedy was elected president, back in 1960, you would think that the second coming had occurred. The way the church was out in full, this is it. Catholics had made it. Catholics had made it. And then, a few years later, when it's found out he's involved with the mafia and the CIA for trying to destroy Castro and so forth and so on, not John Kennedy. I think the President of the United States, he's head of the CIA. That's a black bag operation like the KBG. He's got to run it. You enter into this world, that's what you enter into. The state, with its laws, are grounded in violence. If I enter in, how do I not? As a legislator, as a president, as a military person, police, how do I not use violence to carry out the work of the state? The problem of institutional violence. Violence that is so ingrained in the process of life that it's no longer seen even as violence. And the problem is not limited to the state. Think. Why do parents want to send their children to Catholic schools? Because that's where the discipline is. And what do they mean? Because that's where the sisters and the brothers and the priest and the lay people will slap them down if they get out of hand. That's not what the word discipline means. Discipline comes from the same word as disciple. One follows a particular way voluntarily as a disciple because one sees the truth of that way, not because one has a hammer held over his or her head and must follow or else. Or the family. You know, Christian society that we are, 120 million Christians strong, or 10 million, or whatever it is. Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, television Christians, I don't know, all kinds of Christians all over the place. The largest single area of police calls in any major city, the largest single discernible area is violence in the family. The Christian family, almost like the Christian school, does not know how to operate without violence. It is so ingrained the willingness to use threat, to threaten hurt and to carry it out. Father sitting there in front of the television, huh? Saturday afternoon, he's on his third football game and fourth six-pack. Hardly knows the teams that are on television anymore. Little kid walks in, turns on Sesame Street, or says, "Can I turn on?" Or goes to turn on Sesame Street or something. "Hey, get out of there!" Geez, the kid runs away. Why? Just in the voice, just in the way that it's threat of hurt. I'm going to hurt you if you change raw power. Father, parent, says to the kid, says, or the mother in this case here, says to the kid, what? You don't go to church on Sunday. We're not going to give you tuition at school next year. So the kid drags himself down to some church on Sunday. What's the name of that? Fear. Fear. The law of fear is ruling. And what happens? When one lives in a family where one only knows how to obtain order by dominative power, by violence, by fear, what happens the day that the son or the daughter all of a sudden is stronger than the father and the mother? Stronger intellectually, physically, or whatever the means of fear that were being employed. There goes the order. There goes the peace that was obtained by the use of fear and violence. There are other motivations and ways of doing things where you don't have to rely on fear to achieve order. It can be done. It's just that we don't think of them, we don't know them. And that brings us back to McKinsey. One of the great sufferings is going to be if the church, when the church finally comes around to accepting seriously Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love, that it does not know how to execute them, and the struggle of figuring out how to implement. No place is this a more serious problem than in the state and all various sub-institutions thereof. For indeed, think about it, what is being communicated when we have a Catholic school that uses the same methodology for achieving order as the public school? That is violence and fear. Except now we've got crosses on the wall. Which says what? Which says it's God's way also. Remember, this is only a problem under one understanding of the gospel, and that is, it is only a problem if Jesus' teachings are teachings of nonviolent love. If Jesus says, by word and deed, that the use of violence is incompatible with the will of God, is incompatible with the salvation of humanity. So, why don't we stop there, take a break, and come back, and we'll have a question and answer period before we go on to the next part.